Horror films have been terrifying and interesting moviegoers since the early days of cinema, with the scares constantly changing, from flesh-eating zombies in George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, to, yes, even a sentient tire with the power to make people's heads explode in 2010's Rubber. There's always a new monster to fear. But what if it's not only the monster that scares us, but what the monster represents? What if a movie like The Exorcist, for example, is a way of processing what we fear most? In today's talk, I'll be discussing horror films and classic horror tropes, how they're shaped by our own fears about society, and how they can help us process those fears. So, in a study conducted by Chapman University in April of 2016, researchers took a random sample of roughly 1,500 Americans and asked them about 79 fears in 11 different categories that were wide-ranging, from issues like personal anxieties to fears of technology. While fears that we may normally think about, such as the fear of spiders or public speaking, were on the list, they weren't at the top. After taking the 10 fears that were the highest rated, the number one fear among the people that were surveyed was the fear of corrupt government officials. This was followed by fears such as terrorism and terrorist attacks, people you love becoming seriously ill or dying, economic collapse, and government restrictions on firearms. I think that it says a lot about our country, that it's not clowns or needles that we fear most, but our nation being attacked or our own government turning on us. Some may shrug at the argument that I'm wanting to make here, saying that horror films aren't as deep as I claim them to be, but I ask you to consider this. The highest rated fear was government corruption. Even this can be seen in a popular suspense horror franchise today, The Purge. The Purge centers around the idea that one day a year, all crimes are legal. This allows people one day a year to do whatever they want to do. Throughout the films, though, we can begin to see that the purge has become a sport for the rich and politicians, and has in turn become a means of eliminating the poor in America. That right there is what Americans fear right now, our government becoming corrupt and working against us. That is why I would argue that horror films are more than something produced to make a quick buck. They play off of our anxieties at the moment in which they're made, to help filter the fears that may be too hard for us to process while they're present. As I mentioned earlier, horror movies don't stay stagnant. The types of horror movies that are produced change as we as a society change. In the 1950s, for example, the fear of nuclear annihilation was on the minds of many people around the world, leading to movies such as The 50-Foot Woman and Godzilla. Films such as those were not as popular in the following decades, simply because we found that there were other issues that we were scared about. The deterioration of the nuclear family and the war in Vietnam brought about the slasher film in the late 60s and 70s, which can be seen in films such as The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween. The fear of otherness or being attacked on home soil can be seen in post-9/11 films like the gory Hostel franchise, which is about American tourists being tortured in a foreign country, or J.J. Abrams' Cloverfield, which depicts an alien invasion on Manhattan. I would argue even the Saw franchise can be seen as a response to the so-called enhanced interrogation tactics used by the CIA in places like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay after the 9/11 attacks. We can also see the fear of a worldwide pandemic being shown in the flood of zombie films that infiltrated Hollywood this decade, after public health scares like Ebola permeated our lives. Tropes within the horror genre also play on our underlying fears. The ultimate evil trope is all about the horror being off-screen, something that you can't see, so it's left to your mind's imagination. This trope uses our fear of the unknown on us. Ignorance about something tends to breed fear about the thing itself. Another trope, for example, is the police officer, an authority figure, either being completely useless or being killed by the masked attacker. This trope has its roots in a fear of authority figures either not always being capable of protecting us or not being able to keep us safe. I think it's also important to point out that just as fears of economic downfall were reported by the Chapman Survey, writer Darren Mooney points out that horror movies tend to see a boom during economic recessions. Universal's classic monster films were released during the Great Depression, and the rise of the slasher film happened during the recession of the 1970s. Our fears about what is happening around us have always been used as fuel for horror films, and these films could possibly aid us in viewing those fears through a different lens, that being the silver screen, where it's easier to imagine that the things depicted aren't real. So with that being said, I think that it's important while considering the idea of horror films filtering our anxieties and fears to think about Tom Savini. Tom Savini, the man also known as the Godfather of Gore, is a special effects makeup artist who is well known for his work on movies, such as the original Friday the 13th and 1978's Dawn of the Dead. While he had been interested in horror and special effects artistry throughout his childhood, this really became important as he fought during the conflict in Vietnam. Shayla Dewan wrote an article for the New York Times about whether or not horror films filter the horrors of history. And she included a quote from Savini. While talking about his experience in Vietnam, he discussed his background in horror and how that allowed him to cope with the things that he saw. He said, "You have to turn off your emotions to see this stuff. I almost stepped on an arm, but to me, through a camera, it was a special effect." And I think that's the important takeaway from all of this. This man has spent his entire career using his skill to cope with the horrors that he experienced overseas, and has helped to create some of the most iconic horror films of the 20th century. People like Tom Savini use their craft to filter true horrors, like those from genocide, war, and terrorism, that may otherwise be too much for us to handle up front. It's hard for us to come to terms with these fears and situations up front, but the filter that is the silver screen can put things into perspective. Horror films do so much more than entertain. They make our fears a little bit easier to bear. So, in conclusion, horror films are more than just a medium used to exploit our fears. They use our fears and anxieties, sure, but they do it in such a way as to help us cope with them, while at the same time being entertained. I think it's important to delve deeper into the horror genre, and to ask ourselves, is it the boogeyman himself that scares me, or is it what he represents? Thanks for listening.